Let's look at Kimberly Crenshaw's important text, Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, Identity Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color. This is a complicated text. It's a long reading. There's a lot going on here. So in this video lecture, I'd like to hit upon the key points, the key takeaways for doing our best in this class to understand what Crenshaw means by intersectionality and how this bears out in the lives of women of color. So in this text, Mapping the Margins, Crenshaw argues that male violence against women of color is often the product of intersecting patterns of racism and sexism, which tend not to be represented either in feminist discourse or in anti-racist discourse. So you should hear some resonances from both the Combahee River Collective and the Spellman text on the ampersand problem. Crenshaw's goal here is to explore the race and gender dimensions of violence against women of color through an intersectional lens. So she wants to make these inquiries from concrete locations of women's lives. So she's going to look at the locations of experience of women of color and observe the structural, political, and representational aspects of violence against women of color. So Crenshaw does clarify that this is not an identity theory all the way down. It's a call to account for the multiple grounds of identity. So in some ways, she's going to critique the kind of identity politics that relies on vulgar constructionism and attend to intra-group differences. So in this way, she is relying on identity to account for the particular location of women of color in response to racism and sexism, but she wants to complicate this view because the categories of blacks and women are problematic, as we saw in Spellman's account, in that the discourses surrounding them with respect to racism and sexism focus on black men and white women respectively. So Crenshaw wants to be sure that we account for the multiple grounds of identity. And she's going to do this by looking particularly at domestic violence in the lives of women of color. So Crenshaw defines structural intersectionality as the ways in which the location of women of color makes their situation, specifically here with respect to domestic violence and rape, different than the situations of white women. So, for example, women of color often are dealing with poverty, lack of job skills, discriminatory housing practices, high rates of unemployment, language barriers, and various obstacles that white women typically do not face. In the section on structural intersectionality, Crenshaw gives the example of the Immigration Act of 1990, which was amended with a waiver. So Crenshaw gives the example of the Immigration Act of 1990. And there were good intentions behind the amendment to this act, which provided a waiver for domestic violence. So the marriage provisions of the act required that a couple was married 2 years before they could apply for citizenship. And one of the problems with this was that women who were suffering domestic abuse or violence as immigrant wives would often stay with their husbands simply because they did not want to be deported. And so, as Crenshaw points out, this is a modest attempt to fix a problem, but it doesn't actually fix the problem for women of color who have limited access to the expertise needed to obtain the waiver, to the resources that are blocked by cultural, psychological, and financial barriers, and by dependence on their husbands, and by language barriers. So this amendment that provides the waiver was seen as a solution to the problem of domestic violence with respect to the Immigration Act and the marriage provisions, yet this waiver may have been helpful for some women, but women of color were particularly excluded from the benefits of this waiver. Although the intentions were good, the problem is that because of the dominant discourse around racism and sexism, the particular locations of women of color in this instance were not on the radar, were off grid, so to speak. So when Crenshaw talks about intersectionality, she's talking about the ways in which there is a dominant discourse about the category of race and the category women, and their corresponding anti-racist and anti-sexist discourses. These mainstream discourses that you might think of as highways that intersect are focused on, in the case of race and anti-racist discourse, the lives of black men. And in the case of the category woman and anti-sexist discourse, the category white women. And so if we look at this intersection, and we can think of it as a traffic intersection, we can see that the lives of most white women, of course, we have to take into consideration things like sexuality, class, disability, and those just further complicate intersectionality. So that's not in contradiction with Crenshaw's account, but she starts with race and sex, with racism and sexism, but the intersectional approach can be complicated with further identity categories. But if we look at this as an intersection, and we understand that these dominant discourses concern primarily black men on one axis and white women on the other axis, we have to ask, where are the women of color? Where are their experiences being discussed? And what Crenshaw is pointing out is that their experiences and situations and social locations are not represented by dominant discourses. And this is important because it harms them. When being excluded from policy decisions and allocation of resources, this harms women who are not included in discussions of racism and discussions of sexism. So the intersectional analysis wants to locate women of color and begin from their concrete experiences in order to respond to things like rape and domestic violence in the lives of women of color. If we don't begin from those locations of women's concrete experiences, women of color will be left out by this kind of vulgar identity politics or vulgar constructionism, which relies merely on talk of the category of race and the category of women. So the section on political intersectionality discusses how feminist and anti-racist politics often perpetuate the marginalization of violence against women of color. And the discussion on structural intersectionality should help us to understand political intersectionality. So she gives several examples in this section. One example is on the LAPD statistics on domestic violence. These statistics were not released because they didn't want to make domestic violence a minority problem or reinforce stereotypes of people of color, read black men. Yet, the problem with this is that public funding is dependent upon these statistics. So the problems of domestic violence, that is, women of color being abused and raped, cannot be addressed. Public funding is dependent upon these statistics. And for Crenshaw, this is not a philosophical issue, it's a practical issue because women's lives are at stake. Another example she gives is Alice Walker's novel, The Color Purple. When the Color Purple came out, there was a great deal of conflict in the black community because Celi's character brings to light the silencing and intra-community violence in the black community. And so understanding the community's needs in a certain way can shape the interests so that women's experience is obscured. So not only were black men, but also black women saying that they couldn't identify with Celi's character was a strategy to avoid sedimenting the stereotypes against black men as violent. Yet again, black women's experiences become obscured. A current event that relates to the Color Purple example is President Obama's current initiative called My Brother's Keeper. If you haven't heard anything about this, I would urge you to Google it. So when presidents leave the White House after their term or terms end, they often start an initiative that will be their sort of future work after they leave the presidency. And Obama's proposed initiative is called My Brother's Keeper. And he's been able to generate huge funding for this initiative from wealthy white men because this initiative is aimed at providing resources and programs for young black males that will supposedly be like mentoring programs that will change the lives of young black males. And the way that this is being discussed, or the discourse, the dominant discourse around this initiative in order to fund the initiative, is that it will help to reduce violence in the black communities and give young black males resources for education and having further opportunities, which will in turn reduce violence. One of the major hallmarks of the My Brother's Keeper initiative is that young black men will be given mentors and that this will help them individually and it will reduce violence in the black community. So this sort of discourse focused on black men has been funded largely by wealthy white men because they can buy into this notion that there is a problem with black violence and that if they can give money to help young black males, it will benefit them because they can feel safer. But the problem here is, what about black women? Putting this focus, not only discursively, but in terms of funding and resources and programs on young black males, takes away from the issues of black women once again. And young black girls are excluded completely from this hugely funded initiative that will offer a set of programs and resources, but only for young black males. And the black feminist community has responded to this. It's not clear to what extent the White House will respond. So another example is the CBS interview. So CBS did an interview where they talked to 7 women about domestic violence. 6 of the women were white, 1 was black, and all of the white women were given the opportunity to be personalized, to sort of tell their story, and the black woman basically was used to stereotype black violence. They didn't allow her to be personalized, to talk about her family, the reasons for her attack, or anything like that. They basically used her to show images that were violent and reinforce black violence as a stereotype. The focus here was on black males as violent while limiting or excluding or marginalizing the fact that women of color also suffer domestic violence. Interestingly, there's a commercial on television recently that I keep seeing that reminds me of this example in Crenshaw's analysis. And I'm not sure what the commercial is for because I get so upset that I think I don't pay attention to that. But it's a commercial where about 5 women are showing a picture of someone that they lost on 9/11. And all of the women except 1, I think, are white. And interestingly, all of the white women not only hold up a picture of the person that they lost, whether it was a husband or father, but they also say some things about that person. But it's only the black woman that is there, she's included formally, is there holding up the picture, but she never says anything. She's the only one out of all of the women they show in the commercial who lost someone on 9/11 that doesn't actually speak, doesn't actually tell her story. And I think this is telling because it exemplifies exactly what Crenshaw is trying to get to. Formally, we want to support diversity, we want to include a variety of persons from various identity groups, but the ways in which they're included can be as exclusionary as if we did not include them. Crenshaw gives several other examples. The Central Park jogger, Mike Tyson's rape of Desiree Washington, the senator who supports dealing with violence against women only because he maintains that it's not merely an issue of minority women, but it happens to us too. So it's a white women's problem, therefore we should address it. And this just reinforces Crenshaw's intersectional theory, because we can see what becomes visible. What becomes visible in terms of race and racism, black men, in terms of sex and sexism, white women. The example of shelters for non-English speakers. This is a huge problem, particularly for immigrants of color, because a lot of shelters require women to speak English, and so there's a language barrier. Oftentimes the women who most need help are excluded from the resources that could help them. And again, this is not a philosophical issue, it's not an issue of language, it's an issue about real problems in real people's lives, and it's an issue where their lives are literally at stake. Crenshaw evidences the fact that nearly 40% of all homeless women and children have fled the home because of domestic violence. About 63% of young men between the ages of 11 and 20 who are imprisoned for murder are imprisoned because they've killed their mother's batterers. 63% of men between the ages of 11 and 20 are in prison because they killed their mother's batterer. Nearly 40% of all homeless persons are homeless because they fled domestic violence. So this is a real problem in real people's lives. These are concrete experiences that are being excluded and marginalized. And in the section on representational intersectionality, Crenshaw focuses on the cultural construction of women of color. How do we construct them as a category or group? How are women of color constructed in the dominant social discourse? As she notes, categories are socially constructed, but they do have significance because there are values and social power attached to particular categories, which is why intersectionality as a method is so important, because it requires us to start from the particular lives of women of color, rather than from identity categories themselves. So intersectionality is a method that tracks women of color experiences. Top-down theories, starting from identity categories themselves, might be right and good, but they're not enough, because as you can see, that if we start from the identity categories themselves, categories of race and categories of sex, to deal with anti-racism and to deal with anti-sexism, they might not be bad per se, they might be good for some people, but they don't track women of color experience. And so top-down theories are problematic in that they're not sufficient, they're not enough, because they only track analytic categories of race and gender, which leaves out people in their concrete situations, their experiences of domestic violence, experiences of rape, experiences of poverty, experiences of disability. And these can only be tracked by recognizing that we have to start from people's actual lives. Categorization, putting people into categories, is an exercise of power. But it's more than that, because naming is not unilateral. Power is unequal, but identity remains a site of resistance. So although Crenshaw's not giving an account that is an identity politics account all the way down, she does want to retain a sense of identity as a site of resistance. And this is in alignment with what we read in the Combahee River's Black Feminist Statement. On Crenshaw's view, the most critical resistance strategy is to occupy and defend a politics of social location, rather than to vacate and destroy attention to social location. So this kind of vulgar constructionism, where we focus merely on categories of identity, distorts the possibilities for a meaningful identity politics. So she's not rejecting identity politics per se, identity is important, but it has to be a bottom-up account, starting from people's actual lives, not starting from analytic categories of identity groups. So when identity politics fail women of color, it's not because social categories are taken as natural categories. So it's not a problem of essentialism per se that we saw in de Beauvoir's writing, but it's because the content of the categories themselves, the narratives and discourses that go along with those categories, have privileged some experiences and excluded others. It's absolutely necessary to be able to state and to be heard about what difference makes. So in Crenshaw's view, identity groups are coalitions, or potential coalitions, and attempts to organize identity groups shouldn't be abandoned, but intersectionality requires that we reconceptualize categories like race and categories like women. Race becomes a coalition between men and women of color, and women becomes a coalition between white women and women of color. And this allows a means for addressing marginalized issues and harms from particular women's concrete experiences. So we might need to challenge our home groups, our identity groups, which are often modeled on the identities of a few dominant members. When you think about identity groups, we often overlook the fact that intra-group differences are important, and people can be marginalized within particular groups. So whether you're looking at the category men, the category women, there's going to be differences in that group. Even if you're looking at the category black men, black women, white women, there are going to be marginalized identities, because when you start thinking about identities from a concrete situation, those abstract categories become less accurately descriptive of people's lives. In the group black women, you have class differences, religious differences, differences of sexual orientation, gender differences, etc., that make people's actual concrete situations different within particular groups. Not only different from other groups, but different from other members of the same group. Intersectionality allows, in fact, it requires the acknowledgement and grounding of differences within groups and negotiation in constructing group politics. So intersectionality is a method. It's a bottom-up rather than top-down method that starts from particular lives and experiences in order to identify the ways in which those experiences make a difference in people's lives. So for Crenshaw, male violence against women of color, which is the product of intersecting patterns of racism and sexism, do not show up in feminist discourses or in racist discourses. And so in discussing and dealing with and coming up with policies and resources and programs that are meant to address violence against women of color, this can only happen if we look at the experiences of women of color themselves, because the categories, the dominant discourses, exclude women of color from analysis.